the night the presidency nearly disappeared. It wasn't announced. It wasn't recorded in history books as a breaking point. But for a few fragile hours, the presidency came closer to disappearing than anyone would ever publicly admit. This night didn't begin with violence or rebellion. It began with uncertainty, conflicting signals, delayed responses, a growing realization inside the White House that authority was no longer anchoring the system the way it always had. To understand why this night mattered, we have to understand how fragile the presidency becomes when continuity is threatened. The office does not vanish when a leader leaves a room. It vanishes when belief in its permanence weakens. That belief was under pressure. Key decisions stalled. Critical confirmations failed to materialize. Institutions waited for clarity that never arrived. Each pause compounded the next until momentum drained away entirely. The presidency still existed in title, but its presence was thinning. Inside the Oval Office, the mood shifted from control to containment. Advisors stopped asking how to lead and started asking how to hold what remained together. Every move risked exposing just how little certainty was left. What made this night so dangerous wasn't confrontation. It was absence. Absence of alignment. Absence of response. Absence of the automatic coordination that give the presidency its invisible strength. Power relies on continuity, and continuity relies on trust that tomorrow will look like today. That trust cracked, not with a single dramatic fracture, but with the slow accumulation of moments in which the expected response did not arrive, the expected coordination did not materialize, and the expected certainty from the top was replaced by silence or ambiguity. For the first time, serious voices began asking a question no presidency ever wants to hear. What if the office doesn't disappear loudly? What if it simply fades? What if the mechanisms that sustain the presidency gradually lose their force, not through a dramatic challenge, but through a quiet withdrawal of the belief and expectation that give those mechanisms their power? As the hours passed, it became clear that this night would decide more than a single outcome. It would decide whether the presidency would still exist as a unifying force when morning came, or whether it would wake diminished, altered, and permanently changed. Because once an institution nearly disappears, it never forgets how close it came. As the night deepened, the absence became heavier. Calls went unanswered longer than they should have. Responses arrived without commitment. Every signal from the system felt provisional, as if no one was certain who was supposed to move first. Inside the White House, urgency turned inward. The presidency was still issuing direction, but it no longer traveled with certainty. Messages reached their destinations, yet the expected alignment never fully formed. This is how an institution begins to fade without collapsing. No one defied the presidency outright. No one announced withdrawal of support. Instead, actors waited. They assessed risk. They protected themselves against the possibility that the center might not hold. That waiting was contagious. Each delay justified the next. Each hesitation reinforced the belief that clarity would come later, and later kept slipping further away. The presidency found itself trapped in a moment where acting forcefully risked exposure, and acting cautiously risked irrelevance. The most unsettling realization came quietly. Authority still existed. Responsibility still existed. But expectation had weakened. The system no longer assumed the presidency would resolve the moment. It prepared to endure it. And when endurance replaces expectation, leadership loses its gravity. This was the true danger of the night. Not overthrow, not chaos, but the sense that the office might no longer be necessary to move forward. By the time this realization settled in, the presidency was no longer fighting events. It was fighting disappearance itself. As midnight passed, the presidency entered its most fragile state, uncertainty without momentum. Decisions were drafted, revised, delayed. Each version softened to avoid risk. Each delay signaled doubt. Inside the White House, the question was no longer how to act, but how visible action should be. Too forceful, and failure would be exposed. Too cautious, and absence would deepen. Every option risked confirming what no one wanted to admit, that the presidency was slipping out of sync with the system. Institutions began preparing for autonomy. Quiet contingency plans surfaced. Communication shifted from alignment to survival. The center was no longer assumed to be permanent, just present. This is how disappearance begins. Not with removal, not with rebellion, but with redundancy. When systems learn they can function without coordination, leadership becomes optional. The presidency still spoke, but its voice competed with momentum already in motion. The most damaging effect wasn't operational. It was psychological. Once people stop expecting the presidency to resolve uncertainty, they stop waiting. They adapt. They hedge. They move independently. And with each independent move, the office loses another thread tying it to the whole. By the early hours of the morning, the presidency had not vanished, but had been bypassed. And bypassing power is often more dangerous than confronting it, because confrontation still acknowledges relevance. Bypass does not. It is the most complete form of institutional diminishment, because it does not even grant the office the dignity of opposition. It simply routes around it, as though the presidency were an obstacle rather than a destination. This was the hour when the presidency came closest to becoming a symbol without function, an institution present in name, but fading in effect. And whether that fade could be reversed before dawn remained uncertain. When morning finally arrived, the presidency had not disappeared. The office still stood. The title still carried weight. The machinery of government resumed its rhythm. To the public, nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside the system, the night left a permanent mark. The presidency had come dangerously close to something it was never designed to face. Irrelevance without removal. Power had not been seized. Authority had not been revoked. Instead, the system had briefly learned how to move forward without waiting for the center. That knowledge did not vanish with daylight. Institutions remembered how to act independently. Advisors remembered how silence felt. The presidency itself remembered how close expectation came to breaking. And once that memory exists, leadership can never again assume automatic alignment. This is the quiet aftermath of near disappearance. From that night on, authority required reinforcement. Presence required proof. Direction required urgency. The office still led, but it did so knowing the system could survive without it, at least for a time. History often treats survival as success. But survival after near erasure comes with a cost. It changes how power is exercised. It narrows tolerance for hesitation. It sharpens awareness of fragility. The presidency did not collapse that night. It endured, but it endured with new understanding that its greatest strength is not law or tradition or title. It is belief. Shared belief that the office matters, that direction will come, and that waiting is worth the risk. Once that belief wavers, even briefly, leadership becomes work instead of gravity. The night the presidency nearly disappeared did not end the office. It reminded it how easily it could fade, and that reminder would shape every decision that followed, not as a conscious thought revisited daily, but as a quiet understanding embedded in the institutional memory of the office itself, informing how future leaders would approach moments of uncertainty and how future systems would respond to silence from the center. The